The Victorian winter was not simply a season of cold. It was a prolonged struggle against darkness, hunger, and the limits of human endurance. For millions living across Britain and parts of industrializing Europe, winter meant far more than snow-covered rooftops and frozen streets. It was a time when survival depended on preparation made months in advance, on the resilience of communities, and on the thin line between comfort and catastrophe. In the absence of modern heating, insulation, and reliable food supply chains, the cold months transformed daily life into a continuous battle for warmth and sustenance. As autumn faded, the landscape of Victorian towns and countryside began to change dramatically. The air grew heavier, the winds sharper, and daylight noticeably shorter. People watched the skies with growing concern, knowing that once frost set in, travel would become difficult and work nearly impossible for many labourers. In rural villages, farmers raced to finish harvesting crops before the ground hardened. In cities like London, Manchester, and Birmingham, the working class prepared for rising coal prices and dwindling food availability. The wealthy retreated into better insulated homes, while the poor faced the brutal reality of unheated rooms and freezing nights. Victorian homes varied drastically in their ability to withstand winter. Wealthy households often had multiple fireplaces, thick curtains, and servants to maintain constant fires. Yet even these comforts were limited by the technology of the time. Heat rarely travelled beyond the room where it was produced. Corridors remained cold, bedrooms icy, and drafts slipped through wooden frames and poorly sealed windows. In contrast, working-class families often lived in overcrowded tenements where multiple people shared a single small room. Heating was expensive, and many could only afford coal or wood in limited quantities. Nights were spent huddled together under layers of blankets, relying on body heat to survive the biting cold. Fireplaces were the heart of every Victorian winter household. They were not only sources of warmth, but also centres of activity. Families cooked meals over open flames, dried wet clothing, and gathered for conversation in the flickering glow of firelight. Yet maintaining a fire was a constant challenge. Coal had to be purchased, carried, and stored. Ash had to be removed daily. In poorer households, children were often responsible for collecting scraps of fuel or scavenging for anything burnable. The cold dictated the rhythm of life, and every spark of warmth had to be carefully preserved. Outside the home, winter transformed cities into harsh and often dangerous environments. Streets turned to mud or hardened ice, making travel treacherous. Horse-drawn carriages struggled for traction, and pedestrians risked slipping on frozen pavements. The River Thames, though not always fully frozen in Victorian times, occasionally developed thick ice along its edges during severe winters. Fog combined with coal smoke created dense, choking air that limited visibility and aggravated respiratory illnesses. The urban poor, already weakened by malnutrition, suffered the most during these conditions. Work did not stop entirely during winter, but it became significantly harder. Factory workers still laboured in unheated industrial buildings, where metal machines grew cold and difficult to operate. Fingers numbed quickly, reducing productivity and increasing the risk of injury. Dock workers, street vendors, and chimney sweeps endured long hours outdoors, exposed to freezing winds. For many families, missing even a few days of work meant no income, no food, and no heat. Survival was directly tied to the ability to keep working, no matter how harsh the conditions became. Food scarcity was another defining feature of harsh Victorian winters. Before modern refrigeration and global supply chains, food preservation depended on salting, smoking, and seasonal storage. When winter extended beyond expectations or transportation routes froze, shortages became severe. fresh produce disappeared and diets shifted toward preserved staples such as bread, potatoes, and salted meats. In poorer districts, meals were often repetitive and nutritionally insufficient. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, making diseases like influenza, pneumonia, and tuberculosis more deadly. Water sources also froze during extreme cold, forcing people to break ice or collect melted snow. This added another layer of hardship, as clean water was essential but difficult to obtain. In densely populated urban areas, sanitation systems were already strained, and winter conditions worsened hygiene issues. Disease spread more easily in cramped living conditions where ventilation was poor and bodies remained in close proximity for warmth. Despite these challenges, Victorian society developed coping mechanisms to endure the winter months. Community support played a crucial role. Neighbours often shared resources, particularly in rural areas where isolation made survival more difficult. Churches and charitable organisations distributed food and coal to the poorest families. Workhouses, though harsh and controversial, provided shelter for those who had nowhere else to turn. Winter was a time when social inequalities became especially visible, yet also when acts of compassion became essential for survival. Clothing was another critical factor in surviving the cold. Wool was the primary material used for winter garments due to its insulating properties. People layered multiple pieces of clothing, often wearing the same garments for extended periods. Waterproofing was limited, so dampness from snow or rain could quickly lead to hypothermia. Gloves, scarves, and thick boots were essential, but not everyone could afford adequate protection. Children in impoverished families often went without proper winter gear, making them especially vulnerable. Nighttime brought some of the most difficult challenges. Without electric lighting or central heating, evenings were long and dark, candles and oil lamps provided limited illumination, and fuel had to be conserved. Families often went to bed early to save warmth, sleeping in tightly packed arrangements under heavy blankets. Frost sometimes formed inside poorly insulated rooms, and breath could be seen in the air. The silence of winter nights was broken only by wind, creaking wood, and distant sounds of city life struggling against the cold. Severe winters in the Victorian era occasionally turned catastrophic. Historical records describe periods when temperatures dropped so low that rivers froze solid and transportation came to a halt. Food shortages intensified, and mortality rates increased significantly. The combination of cold exposure and disease created deadly conditions, particularly for infants and the elderly. Hospitals became overwhelmed, and burial rates rose sharply during the coldest months. Yet even in the face of such hardship, Victorian winter life was not only defined by suffering. There were moments of resilience, adaptation, and even beauty. Snow-covered streets transformed cities into quiet, almost surreal landscapes. Icicles formed along rooftops, and frost patterns decorated windows like natural artwork. Families gathered closer, sharing warmth and stories. In some cases, winter fairs and ice skating on frozen ponds provided rare moments of relief and recreation. Technological progress slowly began to change winter survival toward the later Victorian period. The expansion of coal distribution networks improved access to fuel. Early forms of central heating and improved building materials began to appear in wealthier homes. Urban infrastructure gradually improved drainage and sanitation, reducing some of the winter-related health risks. However, for much of the Victorian population, these improvements arrived slowly and unevenly. Ultimately, surviving a harsh Victorian winter required endurance, adaptation, and collective resilience. It was a season that tested the limits of human survival in ways that modern society rarely experiences today. Every aspect of life, from food and work to sleep and social structure, was shaped by the cold. The Victorian winter was not just a backdrop to history, it was a powerful force that defined it. For those who lived through it, winter was remembered not only for its cruelty, but also for its lessons. It taught preparation, community dependence, and the fragile balance between human life and the natural world. In the freezing darkness of Victorian winters, survival was never guaranteed. It was earned day by day, fire by fire, breath by breath.